Well, I love having friends over, and this deck is a great place to entertain and relax. But one thing that's missing is a comfortable reclining chair. So that's today's project on the Great British Woodshop. But first, we're going to visit Chartwell, Sir Winston Churchill's longtime home. And we're going to have a look at his favourite deck chair. Chartwell in Kent was the much-loved home of Sir Winston and Lady Churchill for 40 years. Their children were raised here, they gardened here, and he wrote and painted, and they all delighted in the beauty surrounding them. Churchill held court here while in and out of office. And this was the political heart of Chartwell, the study, and Sir Winston called this his workshop. And he would pace backwards and forwards in here while he was dictating his writings to his harried secretaries, who were at his beck and call 24 hours a day. And he wrote over 50 books and countless speeches here. And in fact, it's the books that were his main source of income. But you can really get a sense for Sir Winston's presence in this room, the dispatch box that he used when he was Prime Minister. And down here is a calendar for his movements in August 1937. What a busy time that must have been for him. And over here by his favourite chair is the classic Churchill cigar. And above the fireplace there's a painting of Blenheim Palace, his grandfather's home, and Sir Winston was actually born there. And above that is the first British flag to fly over a liberated capital during World War II. Well, when I came here to Chartwell for some inspiration, I got to see some places that visitors don't normally get to see. In this case, it was the basement. And I found this. It's Sir Winston Churchill's personal sun lounger. And nobody had seen it in over 40 years. Now, it's a very delicate piece and it hasn't been restored. So we have it sitting on some plastic here to preserve it and prevent any moisture coming in from underneath. I love the lines to this piece. It's made from bamboo, and this raised section in the center here will support your legs from underneath. And it's in a reclined position. And it has a couple of wheels at the back also. The bad news is this piece goes back into storage, and we don't know if we'll ever get a chance to see it again. Well, I like the elegant lines of Sir Winston's chair, so I've kept this in my design. I built it out of Iroko, which is a cheaper alternative to teak. And I've added a few adjustable panels, a leg, seat, and a backrest. And I've also added a couple of wheels so you can follow the sun. One further thing I added was a slide-out tray, which slides either side, and it's a good place to store your drinks. Now we're going to get started on the project by building the two outside rails. Well, I love power tools and woodworking gadgets of all sorts, but I treat them all with the greatest of respect, and you should too. The only time I ever remove the guard is so you can see what I'm actually doing. It's an important safety feature and should otherwise always be left on. Well, right at the beginning of the project, I'm presented with a bit of a problem. This is one of the rails, and it's nearly 2 meters long. The bed on my jointer table is only 1 meter long, and ideally you want the material supported throughout its entire length when you use the jointer. So what I've done is brought my workbench over and built a little platform that sits level with the in-feed table on the jointer. And at the other end, I've put a roller to support the material as I push it through. After several passes on the jointer, I now have this, a nice flat surface with no twist. It's distortions like this that we're trying to get rid of, and that's why the jointer is such a useful tool. Now the goal is to make this edge perfectly flat and square to this face. And to do that, I'm going to rotate the stock over. So I have a high point at that end and at this end, and that'll stop it from rocking. With each pass over the jointer, the blades will remove more and more material until I'm left with a completely flat surface. Now the rail goes through the thickness planer face side down, and I'll continue to run it through until I get it down to 35mm thick. This last edge gets cut at the table saw. I've set the rip fence to 76mm. That leaves 1mm to clean up the sawn edge on the jointer. At the heart of the project is 3 main panels: the leg rest, the seat, and the backrest. And they're all constructed in exactly the same way. Mortise and tenon joints in all of the corners of the frame. There are 14 slats in each section, and each of these slats has a tenon on the end, and that tenon will fit into a groove that I'm going to mill in the top and bottom rails. The leg section and the seat are held together by a hinge, and the back of the seat pivots on a screw. The back panel is fully reclinable, and this H-frame allows me to set 4 different heights. And making the back panel is next. I've cut all the pieces for the backrest support to length, and here's how it's going to look. A mortise and tenon joint here, and underneath there's a space to house the backrest support. Now I like to present a wide face on the outside here because it gives it a more substantial look. Now there's 2 marking up operations that I need to do in order to set up the jig. And the first is to mark a centre line. Now this board here is 25mm thick, and this is just a regular piece of ply, but it just happens to be 12.5mm wide. So to mark a centre line, I just line up the back and put a line. That's how easy that is. Now the next step is to mark out where the tenons will start and stop. So I'm coming in 10mm from each end. Now I'm ready to set up the jig. Now the beauty of a jig is once it's set up, you can make multiple tenons quickly. I'll just clamp the timber into the jig. Now the first part of the operation is to set up this top plate, and you use the setup bar to do that. I just position the bar so that it's right over the top of that centre line that I marked, which is halfway across the board. Lock that in place. Now these plates set up the length of the tenon, and to do that I'm using the setup bar again. We're using a 16mm cutter, so I slide the right hand plate until the 16mm mark is right over the top of the pencil mark we marked earlier. And then I slide the bar over to the left and do the same on that side. And that'll determine where the tenon starts and stops. Now to cut the mortises, I haven't had to make any changes to the depth of the bit. All I've done is change this collar. And I'm adding a large diameter bush. Now this bush rides inside this opening, and the idea is that it prevents any sideways movement. I can only move up and down, and that's how we cut the mortise. I haven't made any changes to the jig itself either. All I've done is slide a board in and lined up a 10mm pencil mark with the 16mm indicator line on the setup bar, just like we did before. Now, anytime you're cutting wood, it's a dusty old business, so make sure you have a good dust extraction system installed. Mine is just hooked up to the shop vac. But if you don't have that, just wear a mask. No, it fits great. When I made up the original deck chair, it had 244 mortise and tenon joints in it. Now, even with a jig, that's an awful lot of work, so I've come up with a couple of shortcuts. The rails that make up the back section, the seat, and the leg assembly each had 14 mortise and tenons in it. That's a total of 84. So the shortcut is to run a single trench down the inside of each of the rails. And I'm going to cut the trenches over on the table saw. And to do that, I'm going to use a stacked dado head cutter. And that consists of an outside blade with 1 or more chippers, and I'm only using 1 in this case, and another outside blade. Now, a lot of my fellow woodworkers were surprised to find out that it's perfectly acceptable to use dado head cutters or groovers in the UK, if you have a table saw that will accept them. I checked with all the government agencies and was assured that they can be used as long as they're used safely. I also found out that the agency that sets the standards for the manufacturers state that the maximum width of cutter allowed is 15.5mm, and I've set my cutter up to 10mm. Now I'm ready to cut the tenons on the ends of the slats. I've added a piece of scrap timber here to act as a sacrificial fence to prevent the blade from damaging the surface of the rip fence. And it also acts as a reference point because the distance between this surface here and the outside edge of this blade is 10mm. And that'll give me a tenon that's 10mm deep and 10mm thick. Here's a little something I learnt when I built the original deck chair. Much better to drill a hole to accept these brass threaded nuts now than to do it later. If you wait until you've assembled the whole back assembly, You'll have to drill a hole all the way through to be able to put the nut in, and then you'll have to plug it. And I don't want to do that again. So I'm going to drill a hole with a 10mm brad point bit, and I'll just thread the insert in with a screwdriver. And later I'll attach the adjustable back support to these brass fittings. Well, now we're going to get back to the rails, one of which I've already completed. It has 11 mortises across the bottom where the stretchers will go, and one mortise in the top where the center divider will separate the seat and the backrest. Now the rails are so long I couldn't fit them in the jig, so what I've done is brought the top of the jig over to here and clamped it to the piece. I drew some center lines where that's the center of the tenon, and I've marked in 5mm for where the tenon will start. Well, that's the mortise for the center divider completed. Now it's onto the stretchers. Well, that's all the tenons cut on the 11 stretchers, and they'll fit into the mortises that I cut in the rail. When we come back, we'll start putting this deck chair together. Well, welcome back to the Great British Woodshop. Today we're building a reclining deck chair. In the first half we worked on the main rails and the parts for the backrest, and now I'm ready to glue that backrest up. Well, the tenon goes into the mortise, just dry for now. I just wanted to act as a guide. I've put 2 spaces there, and I'm going to add a little glue to each of the tenons. And then I'll just slip it in, and then add 2 more spaces and some more glue, and just keep going until I get to the top. I've put glue in the mortises and now on the tenons for this outside rail. I'll put this on, put some glue on the other side. I'll flip it over, and then I can put some glue on this rail, and then when it's all glued up we'll put some clamps on it. 978. 978.5. That's good enough. I'll leave it there to dry. Well, I've dry assembled the main frame, and I've put in the seat and the backrest assembly, which dried up overnight. I've installed some spacer blocks here that are 10mm to provide some clearance between the center divider and the backrest. I've drilled a couple of holes that are 30mm in and 10mm down. And I'm just using this bolt to mark the rail. And I'll do the same on the other side, and that'll give me an indicator of where to drill the hole in the rail. Now I don't want anything to spoil the outside finish of these rails, so all the fasteners I'm using are hidden from the inside. The hole I drilled goes only part way through. Now take your time when you're threading in this brass nut, because it has to go in perfectly square. Otherwise, the screw won't go through the hole and engage the nut. I'm cutting a 45-degree bevel on the center divider so the backrest can pivot freely. I've softened the edges of the leg, seat and backrest assemblies, and I'm just softening the top outside edge of both the rails. Now, gluing up a project with this many joints is a sticky business. It's a tricky business. It could be a sticky business too, unless you get a move on, because with these modern glues it sets up really quickly. I'm using a damp sponge to wipe up any glue now. It's much easier to get it off while it's wet than after it's dry. Now this is the tricky part. Getting all 12 mortises lined up with all 12 tenons. And it doesn't really matter how many extra hands you've got on board, it isn't going to make this job any easier. But we'll get it. just going to pull the whole frame together with some clamps. And I'm using quite a few clamps because I want an even pressure throughout all of the joints. Before you fully tighten the clamps, make sure you check for square. And it is. I've angled the front and back legs because I think it gives a really nice, elegant look to the piece. And they're attached to the main rails with mortise and tenon joinery. The back legs are shorter than the front, and they're rounded at the bottom, and I've attached some wooden wheels with some carriage bolts. We're going to get started making these next. I'm using a cardboard template to mark out the detail for the legs. The first cut I'm making is for the top of the tenon. I'm going to freehand this next cut on the bandsaw and then sand it to the line. I'm notching out the material for the tenon, and I'll remove the rest of it over on the tenoning jig. These two legs are rounded off at the bottom. These are the ones that will have the wheels attached to them. I'm using a compass to mark out an arc. I'll rough cut it out of the bandsaw and finish it up at the sanding station. I'm going to make the wheels out of a blank of 35mm thick stock. And the first thing I want to do is just find a centre line. So I'm just using my centre finding square. And I've set my compass to 75mm. I'll just draw a circle. And I'm just going to rough it out at the bandsaw. To sand the wheel to a perfect circle, I'm going to use this attachment for my sanding station. It's a little sliding block with a sharp pin on it. And to set it, I'm going to locate that pin in the centre of my wheel. I'm just going to set that to 75mm and then lock it in place. The sharp pin will sit in the centre of the wheel, and I've sanded a flat right to the line, and that's 75mm from the centre to the outside. And as I rotate it around, it'll sand me a perfect circle. I'm using a rounding over bit on the edges of the wheel, and I'll drill a 10mm hole for the axle over at the drill press. For the axle, I'm using a carriage bolt, which has got a smooth shank on it. Now, if I used a bolt that was threaded all the way along, over years of use, the wheel turning around would be damaged by the thread. The top of the carriage bolt has got a square section, so to mark that out, I'm just going to stick the bolt through one of the dog holes in the bench. And then I can remove this square part with a little chisel. Where the legs join the rail, I'm just going to celebrate that joint by putting a chamfer on here with my block plane. Chamfering the bottom of the two long legs will prevent any chipping as the chair gets moved around. Well, this part of the glue up is a lot less frantic with only 4 legs. A little bit of glue in the mortise, some on the tenon. And I'm not even going to worry about some clamps here. I'll just let gravity be my friend. Well, I made the back support with some more of those mortise and tenon joints. I've rounded over the top here to allow it to pivot. And I've drilled a couple of holes. And now I'm going to attach it to those brass inserts that we installed earlier. And before I do, I'm just going to add a washer as a spacer. The tray's made up of 6 panels, and I've already cut the tongues on the table saw. I've installed a slot cutting bit in the router table and set the fence the right distance away. And I'm just going to set the height of the cutter using my height adjusting depth gauge. I'm going to set that to 10.5mm. And now I'm ready to cut the slots in the sides of both of those rails. The secret with any joinery is not that you want the joint so tight that you have to hit it in with a hammer. You just want it snug enough so that it'll fit together and allow the glue to do some of the work. I'm just adding a 10mm spacer between each panel just to evenly distribute them out. And that takes care of the drinks tray. Well, this is the underside of the seat and leg assemblies, and I'm getting ready to attach them with a couple of these brass hinges. Now, I've put a couple of washers between the two panels just to give it a little bit of a space, And these are called card table hinges. I guess they use them on card tables. Now I'm just going to wrap my pencil around the outside to mark out for the mortise. And then I'm going to cut out that mortise with a straight cutting bit in the router. I've installed a guide fence onto the router that'll run along the edge of the panel and make sure that the mortise is cut in the right place. With a sharp chisel, I'm squaring up the corner of the mortise. I'm drilling the holes with a self-centering drill bit. This sleeve slides back and the end of it is a perfect match for the countersinking in the hinge. And as I push it through, the drill bit will be located dead center of the hole. The backrest is in and I'm just about to attach the last screw on the seat assembly. These are zinc plated screws. Slipping a little washer in behind for clearance. Now you can see why it's important to mark those while the whole assembly is in place, otherwise you'd never get those to line up. As I attach the wheel to the leg, I'm just sticking on 2 stainless steel washers, another one on the other side, and a nylon locking nut. That'll be fine. Well, the final cut in this project is a rebate in these 2 rails that will support the sliding drinks tray. Once I get these holes drilled, I'll attach the supports with some stainless steel screws. That slides just great. That's the perfect place for an ice cold drink. Well, I've given everything a sanding with some 120 grit paper, and I've vacuumed it all off and cleaned it up with a tack rag to remove the dust. I've also wiped it all over with some cellulose thinners, and that's to help the wood absorb the finish. Well, normally I'd apply this finish with a brush or a rag, but because there's so many nooks and crannies in here, I'm going to spray it. Now the finish I use for my outdoor projects is a water-based finish, and it contains UV inhibitors, which will help prevent the timber from going grey in the sunlight. A good technique when you're spraying is to make sure that you pull the trigger before you reach the piece and then let it go at the other side after you've finished. When you come back for a second pass, pull the trigger again before you reach the piece, and again when you've finished, let it off once you've gone past the other side. If you do this, you'll minimize the risk of runs. Another way to minimize runs is to keep the nozzle of the gun at right angles to the piece you're spraying. Well, that's one coat on. I'll have a rest for an hour, then we'll stick on another coat and it'll be ready for the deck. Well, I can't decide whether to start in the hot tub and finish in the deck chair, or start in the deck chair and finish in the hot tub. I wish all my choices were that easy. Well, that's it for today on the Great British Woodshop. I'm David Free. We'll see you next time.